The last two sections of chapter 2, culture and interpersonal communication, deal with codes and culture and developing intercultural communication competence. When we think of codes, there are two types of codes, verbal codes and non-verbal codes. Living in a culture where English is the dominant language will cause you not to realize how language affects your sense of self, both for yourself and those around you. But what happens when some members of a society speak a dominant language, English, while others speak another language? Those who are part of the minority who don't speak the dominant language can feel pressure to assimilate, or they can decide not to speak in the majority language. The impact of a language on the self-concept is powerful, is what researchers tell us. So it's not surprising that people feel most at home, most confident and comfortable when communicating in their mother tongue and with people from their own cultural background. Even the names a culture uses to identify itself reflects its values and shapes the way its members relate to each other. So let's get down specifically now to verbal communication styles. Verbal communication styles is more than just the amount of formality that one might use, or informality, precision or vagueness, and brevity or detail. It's more than that. In fact, one researcher describes 3 important types of cultural differences in verbal style. The first we've looked at already is direct versus indirect. We've looked at how low context cultures versus high context cultures speak differently. They use low context cultures will use language directly to express thoughts, feelings, and ideas, whereas high context cultures may speak less directly, using language to maintain social relationships and social harmony. The second important type of cultural difference in verbal style is elaborate versus succinct. So, speakers of Arabic, for example, commonly use language that is more rich and expressive than that would be found in English. Succinctness, brevity, being precise, is most extreme in cultures where silence is valued. And you see this in Native American cultures and Asian cultures as well. Formal versus informal. Now we get to formality, as we referred to earlier on. And you see the difference between British English speakers and American English speakers. The British tend to be far more formal, whereas most Americans tend to be neighborly and want to be liked and friendly. It's a difference in formality in some sense. Very often, formality isn't so much a matter of using correct grammar as observing the social norms. Code switching. Communicators often adapt their manner of speaking when they are in a different context, and this is what we call code switching. It's a form of communication competence that increases the chance of achieving your goal. Code switching happens in a variety of cultures. One writer explains how African Americans often adapt mainstream white speech mannerisms as a means of self-defense. Shifting between codes doesn't require rejecting your heritage. Think of it as a type of bilingual ability. So with verbal codes, there aren't rights and wrongs necessarily. They reflect different cultures, and being aware of cultural differences will allow you to see these differences and to acknowledge people who are speaking with a different style, and with individuals who do code switch. So it's always important to think through exactly why you're code switching, to make sure that it's not because you reject or are ashamed of your cultural background. Non-verbal codes are somewhat universal, not all of them. There are certain universal signs, like crying is a universal sign of unhappiness or pain. A smile signals friendly intent. Now, often smiles and tears may be insincere and manipulative, but the sign is universal. The AOK sign is somewhat ambiguous. It's not as universal as we think. It's a cheery affirmation in the West, but in France and Belgium, it means you with zero. In Japan, it means money, and in Greece and Turkey, it's an insulting or vulgar sexual invitation. So there is a certain amount of cross-cultural ambiguity. Less obvious cross-cultural differences can damage relationships without the communicators ever realizing or recognizing that something has gone wrong. Westerners tend to use the largest zone of personal space, followed next by Asians, whereas people from the Mediterranean and Latinos use the closest distance. Imagine the awkward advance and retreat pattern that might occur between two individuals, one from the West and the other one from the Middle East. The Middle Easterner keeps on moving forward to close the gap, while the North American moves back, and both would feel very uncomfortable. Like distance, patterns of eye contact certainly vary around the world. Americans learn to maintain eye contact during conversations, and avoiding eye contact can be interpreted as being insincere or a sign of weakness. On the other hand, in China, a mutual gaze is only appropriate in close interdependent relationships. The final section, which we're going to add on here, is developing intercultural competence, communication competence. So, as an intercultural communicator, it's important to have a wide range of behaviors and to be skillful at choosing the correct behavior for that particular context, for that situation. Certainly a genuine concern for the other plays an important part. It takes a certain amount of complexity and ability to empathize and even help those who are from different cultures, and it can be challenging. And then self-monitoring is important, because the need to make a correction, to change, to adjust mid-course very often is an appropriate way of dealing with individuals from different cultures. So look at some of those individually. Motivation and attitude. So the desire to communicate successfully with strangers is an important start. People are highly willing to communicate with people from other cultures, report a greater number of friendships from different backgrounds than those who are not willing to reach out. A second characteristic is tolerance for ambiguity. When we encounter communicators from different cultures, the level of uncertainty is especially high, and you need to be able to deal with that level of uncertainty. So somebody who wants to become a competent intercultural communicator, they accept, even welcome this kind of ambiguity. Open-mindedness is the next one. If we think of open-mindedness, it's important to consider two traits that are incompatible with it. One is ethnocentrism. That's an attitude that your own culture is superior to others. An ethnocentric person thinks either privately or publicly or openly that anyone who does not belong to his or her in-group is somehow strange, wrong, or even inferior. So how do you develop open-mindedness? Learning the language of the person that you're communicating with certainly is one way that'll open your mind to a foreign culture. You'll realize very quickly that every language carries within it its own worldview, a way of understanding and talking about life's event. And so being bilingual, being able to speak more than one language, is strongly linked to intercultural communication competence. Ethnocentrism, on the other hand, leads to an attitude of prejudice, an unfairly biased and intolerant attitude toward those who belong to the out-group. So somebody who's involved in prejudice very often is involved in stereotyping, and stereotypical prejudices include the obvious exaggerations that, for example, all men are emotional, all women are emotional, all men are sex crazed and insensitive goons, all older people are out of touch with reality, and all immigrants are welfare parasites. Of course, we know that these are all stereotypes and they're negative. Not all members of a group are equally individualistic or collectivistic, so be careful even when you try to stereotype Westerners as individualistic. You can't paint the entire West with that label. There's some individuals within the West who are somewhat collectivistic, all right? Same thing with Asians. You might want to say that all Asians are collectivistic, but you'll find that what applies to the whole doesn't necessarily apply to the individual, and you might find some very individualistic Asians as well. Knowledge and skill. Attitude is one thing, and having the right attitude and motivation is great, but you need something else. You need knowledge and skill. Knowledge of the other cultures and the skill to know when to implement. So it's important that you and I be mindful, that you and I are aware of our own behavior and the behavior of those around us. Patience and perseverance is another characteristic. Being comfortable and competent in a new culture is going to be rewarding, but it's going to take some time. It's not easy at first. You might feel confused, lonesome, and homesick if you are in a foreign culture. You may feel disappointed in yourself for not adapting as soon as or as easily as you expected. You may experience culture shock or adjustment shock. So you will be blindsided by culture shock. So the transition from culture shock to adaptation and growth is successful, but it's not necessarily a linear or smooth process. All right, that's the essence of chapter 2.